Hi, this is Bob, and today I want to walk you through how I dye my reed, my rattan reed for basket weaving. And when I first started weaving, I used to dye with RIT dye, but I've transitioned to using a dye called Procion Fiber reactive dye, and is by Dharma Trading Company. And today I'm going to be doing this example with dyeing with Sequoia redwood. And what's required with this dye, you don't have to boil or use hot water. You can do it with cold water, but it tends to stay very, very color fast. And I like the way that the colors in the process I use are fixed really firm and don't bleed later. So to do this, first of all, I'm going to need a pan that I can put my 1 pound of reed in. And once I uncoil it, it can lay loosely in here and move around, and the dye will get easily around all the reed. So I'll uncoil this in a few minutes. This pan I got from the feed and tack store here in Pierce, Arizona, or in Wilcox, excuse me, and it's just a perfect size because it's got flat sides, it's nice and big and round, and the 1 pound of reed can lay loosely in it, but you can use anything. For a while I was dyeing reed in like a kitty litter box, which actually, a plastic kitty litter thing, which was a great size for reed dyeing too. Then I'm going to, I have a pot, an old pot that's a little bit over a gallon, fits a little bit, a gallon and a pint or so of liquid, and an old spoon to mix up my salt and dye and soda ash bath. I use salt, plain salt, and it can be non-iodized. Soda ash as a fixative, so soda ash, and you can either get this, it's technically, it is sodium carbonate, and you can get it, one way to get it is from a pool supply company. They sell sodium carbonate, or I get it from a supply place online, and it raises the pH. And some kinds of sodium carbonate will clump up in the water and some won't. This one, it's by Sesco, seems to be a pretty good one. It doesn't clump up. And then you'll need some kind of measuring cup. So this is a 1/2 cup measuring thing, and this is a 1 tablespoon measuring cup. And those are pretty much all of the supplies that I'm going to need to get my reed going. At the end of it all, I also use a chemical fixative that I get from Dharma Trading Company, and for some colors like reds and purples, the really deep colors, I add some of that fixative afterwards because it keeps the color from bleeding later. I am going to be sending out a single-page instruction sheet specifically for Procion Fiber reactive dyeing. And it's a set of instructions, but the highlights are really that for a gallon of water, which is basically, you need a gallon or a little over a gallon to dye a pound of reed, you should be putting and mixing in a 1/2 cup of salt and 1 tablespoon of dye, and it says later, after that soaks for a while, put in 1/3 cup of soda ash that's been diluted. I dilute the soda ash and the salt and the dye all together right up front, and then I let it sit in the dye, generally overnight. What I first do is take a 1/2 cup of salt, and I put that in my my stock pot here. And this helps to open up the fibers and open up the reed so that it's going to take the dye. And I like to dilute this in the water first, and then once that's fully diluted with a little bit of water, it doesn't have to be hot, but just warm water in the bottom, it helps to dilute the salt faster. Then I put in my soda ash. So I've diluted my salt in the water, and I have just a little, about 1/2 of my pot filled with warm water to dilute the salt. And now very slowly, I'm going to start to pour in, and this is soda ash now. This is my 1/2 cup of soda ash. And I slowly mix this in and dilute it. And you want to do it little by little and get it to dilute, because if you put it in too fast, it tends to sort of clump up into hard nodules or like clumps. And I like it to get diluted completely fully. So I just stir this until all the granules have dissolved. and it's well diluted. The instructions on the Dharma Trading Company say for 1 gallon of water, put 1 tablespoon of dye, but I usually put a little bit more than that because I like a richer color dye. So with this Sequoia redwood and a 1 tablespoon measuring, I will put 1 and then probably close to a half on top of that of dye. And be very careful as you're handling the dye. A lot of times I'll wear gloves. I just happen to not be wearing gloves at the moment. And then once you get the dye in the water, be very careful and start stirring it and diluting it. And what I typically do is I'll put it near my utility sink and slowly run warm water into it. The warm water just helps it dilute quicker, and make sure any clumps of dye are completely diluted and you don't have any like clumped up dye floating on the top. And just take your time stirring it so that it's all nicely diluted. Once the dye is mostly diluted in this bucket, in the pot, then I take it with warm water and fill it all the way the rest up and make sure it's completely diluted. Then what I'm going to do is pour it into my pan, and you can see I've uncoiled my reed completely, even the ends, so they can all flow loose. And then I'm going to be dumping this into that pan. So now that I've got my dye solution completely diluted, I'm going to pour it in on my reed. And just make sure that you don't splash it too much, because it does stain readily. And then you want to make sure that you're pushing the reed down and getting it all wet so it lays in there nicely. And if for some reason your bundle of reed seems to be sitting slightly above the water level, feel free to put in a little bit more water, and I usually rinse my pot and get the last of the dye out of that and pour a little more water in so it completely covers all the reed. And then what I'm going to do is let this reed, and you can already see it's starting to take the dye, and with some colors, even a couple of hours, the reed will dye just great. But I like to typically leave it overnight and get it as deep as it possibly can, and then I'll rinse it after that. So this has been overnight, and you can see how rich and deep the color is. Now I'm going to rinse it several times until the water comes almost clear. And most people wouldn't put a final fixative on it, but I use a fixative chemical that I get from Dharma Trading Company. And I just put a small amount, and I'll show you how much I measure. And then soak that for 45 minutes or an hour, rinse it again quickly, and then it's very color fast and ready to go to weave. So I just used my big utility sink, and I've dumped out the dye water, and then I just fill it several times with water enough to cover the reed, shake it around, and then rinse it out. And I do this 3-4 times, depending upon which color you're using. Some colors rinse faster. This color is a deeper reddish brownish color, so I'm going to rinse 3-4 times with water. And I just rinse all around and then shake it, rinse all around. Just get that reed dye out. I've now rinsed my reed where it comes almost clear, just a very faded light pinkish color rinses off. And then I use this chemical, it's called dye fixative, for my darker colors, and a little bit less than a 1/4 cup for a pound of reed. I just pick that dye fixative in the water, and then fill the rest of the tub up with water so it covers the reed. Let it sit for 45 minutes or an hour. Do 1 or quick rinses, and then just let the reed dry, and I'm ready to weave. after I rinse the reed with a fixative chemical. This is how the reed color looks wet. In addition to the Procion dye process that I just kind of walked through, it's possible also, and a lot of people first do this using RIT dye. I don't have a lot of experience using RIT dye, although I don't know if it's as color fast as the Procion dyes, but the RIT dye, you need very hot water, very warm water to soak the reed. And I think it's like a half a bottle of liquid dye for maybe a pound of reed with the water based on the instructions I've read. But again, I don't have a lot of experience with that. What I have tried a couple of natural dyes. The two that work well are black walnut and pomegranate. And for black walnut, I'll harvest the walnuts right after they fall from the tree, usually in August, where they're bright green and there's like a soft husk around it. And I'll put gloves on and take 15 or 20 walnuts to dye a pound of reed. And I put the gloves on and I'll pinch the green husk and get the nut out from the inside, but take all the pulp and the green husk and everything, and that's where the dye is, and put that in a big pot, and about 15 walnuts husks worth, and then fill it with hot water, let it boil for an hour or two, and then put reed in a bin like I showed you, the green bin, and I will pour the water through a filter, like a sifter, and filter out some of the major pulp, and then put it in the dye and let it sit overnight. And it's a mordant and it's a setter and a fixative all in one. The black walnut is great, and it comes out like a brownish, somewhere between light tan and root beer colored, and it's a really nice color. And there's nothing else you have to do with it other than just rinse it. There's no chemicals, nothing else. Pomegranates are a little bit different. Pomegranates, it's the rind that creates the color. And if you Google it and look online, you'll see that if you take maybe two pomegranates worth of rind, so you take the seeds out and set them aside, and I like to eat them, so I just put them in a big bowl and they're fun to eat. And then you cut the rind up and then boil the rind similarly in hot water for an hour to a couple of hours. And then what I do with that is I take the reed, because I don't think the pomegranate has a mordant and it opens up the fibers as well as the walnut does. So I took the reed and mixed it with salt water, like a third of a cup or a quarter of a cup of salt, and let it sit in warm water in the salt for an hour or two, which opens the fibers up. Then I pour the pomegranate brew, so to speak, or the dye bath, and pour that onto the reed and let that sit overnight. And that also comes like a golden brownish, a little bit on the gold side, a little bit on the tan side, but it's a very, very nice color, and it stays color fast. So those are all the dye approaches that I've used with rattan so far. And I think it's just a journey. I've tried coffees, I've tried teas, I've tried beet juice. None of them have stained well and have remained color fast for me, but maybe you'll have better luck. But I would say try anything and everything and experiment. But I have found, for my purposes with the colors that I use in baskets, that Procion dye, the fiber reactive dye from the Dharma Trading Company, works the best. So I hope you do all of this and do some dyeing on your own, and don't hesitate to call me or reach out by email and ask if you have any questions at all.